I'm Yasmin Vobis.
I'm Aaron Forrest, and our office is named Ultramoderne.
This year's theme, impermanence, is kind of interesting for us because I think typically, or as a culture, I think we kind of romanticize architecture as this kind of, the stuff that transcends time, the stuff that's kind of permanent. And I think for us, it was interesting to think about how architecture would also include the things that are impermanent, right? All the kind of social structures, the kind of uses of the spaces, all these other time scales that could become part of the work.
We've been thinking a lot in our recent work about the way people use the space as a way that can be a kind of driver for the design, and thinking about the contained space rather than the kind of final object of the project in a way. In addition, we've also been working with wood as a material, which has a kind of sustainability argument to it in terms of the lifetime of the material. And so, thinking about not just architecture as objects, but as kind of material and social conditions as well.
We're showing four recent projects, really 4 experiments, I would say, in 3 different media. So there's a drawing, there's a photograph, and there's a model of each one. And the basic idea was really to show these kind of partial views of the project, to talk about this kind of, I guess, multiplicity of representations for architecture that kind of relates to these multiple understandings of architecture as well, especially in the public realm.
So the photographs are kind of purposely ambiguous or abstract in terms of how they represent the project, so you couldn't get the whole thing just from a kind of single view. Likewise, the drawings are done with a kind of hatching pattern, which kind of hovers somewhere between line and tone, and so in our minds, understanding the kind of analytical facts of the project, but also what is the ambience of the project. At the same time, the models are meant to be a kind of simplified or almost like dumbed down version of the final geometry of the project, in order to really foreground the kind of space that it sets up and the kind of social atmosphere of the project.
And I think that kind of speaks to a greater interest, I think, in our work that's really these kind of abstract qualities in architecture that are about, rather than kind of focusing on expressing the details of the architecture, it's about these kind of abstract surfaces that really set the stage for the social.
I think that, we selected basically our 4 most recent projects, just because, like we talked about in terms of the theme of impermanence, we see architecture as this kind of confluence of different forces being brought together in kind of incompatible ways. And these 4 projects represent a kind of recent interest in bringing together the idea, 2 different ideas of the word structure. So one is structure like the way things stand up, like we're used to referring to in architecture. The other has to do with organization, social organization. And so these aren't 2 things that always really belong together. So we see the projects as kind of 4 different collisions between social structure and physical structure, and the way that collision might play out in 4 different settings.
I think each one of the projects, except for maybe one of them, is really a construction in the world, right? I think we're really interested in, whatever we're interested in the office, that we actually bring it out into the world and kind of test it that way. And I think for us, it's been interesting to see, I guess, how people use the projects differently in ways that we wouldn't expect, right? So for us, I would say each one of them is an experiment that, the project doesn't just kind of exist on the drawing board, but that once it's put into place, it takes on this other life, this other time scale, I would say, this other meaning, I think, through that.
It's interesting, we really enjoyed documenting the projects, both in terms of representing them before in the design process and then going back and photographing afterwards. So we've, when we started out, we basically only did photographs and drawings because we didn't have the opportunity to design buildings for anyone. So we were really just kind of doing this kind of multimedia, almost art practice. And we have come to kind of see architecture itself as a kind of multimodal practice.
I think in our recent work, we've been working with very kind of actually straightforward kind of structural materials and leaving them raw and exposed in the project. And part of that has been in some ways to maximize the space and the kind of social gesture of the project, right? So kind of build as cheaply as possible and to kind of create the most generous spaces as possible. But also, I think going back to Erin's comment about the relationship between social structures and the actual structure of the building, that to us it's very interesting that the actual structure is something that is exposed and is the actual architecture itself. It's not something that kind of gets covered up in kind of a veneer of, you know, beautiful or precious materials or things like that.
Yeah, I think Yasmin is kind of prodding me to say something about concrete, because in some ways we see the cross-laminated timber as the kind of new like what concrete was to the early modernists, in the sense that it's a material that can embody both structure and finish, and that you can have a kind of rawness to the space and to the project that foregrounds some other aspects, the social agenda or the structural agenda.
Boundary is actually really important to us, or the kind of definition of the boundary in the project. I think our Chicago project and our PS1 proposal are kind of two extremes of boundaries. I would say that Chicago is completely open, right? The whole idea of the proposal was to make a pavilion that's as open and porous to the city as possible, so that new publics and all kinds of activities could take place. And I think PS1 is actually the inverse. It's actually the creation of the boundary. That's the most important act of that project, to kind of create a space that's apart from the city, to kind of create the space where people can play. It's a space of fantasy, and so boundaries are incredibly important.
We've been really interested in thinking, okay, you know, we've used the boundary to set the condition for the project. It often sets us into a position where what we want to do is structurally impossible. So then we're working backwards to think, okay, how do we rethink our kind of preconceptions of structure in order to really, in order to make this boundary condition that we're interested in possible?